The first reading of today is taken from the first book of Kings and has as its background the prophet Elijah. Elijah is running away because he is frightened. He has spoken against the king. He has spoken against the queen, and the queen has threatened him that she will not tolerate his speaking against the king and queen, even though they have been unjust, even though they have been corrupt, even though they have been belligerent with the Lord. And Elijah is a prophet, so like the prophet who speaks on behalf of God, he said it like it was. And even after Elijah said it like it was, he was threatened. And he was threatened with his life, and so Elijah runs away. And Elijah comes to a cave. And the Lord invites Elijah to stand at the entrance of the cave. And even as Elijah stands at the entrance of the cave, there is a mighty wind. And the wind is so powerful that it smashes rocks and brings down mountains. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, another natural phenomenon, an earthquake, which swallows everything in sight. And the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a raging fire which scorches and burns everything so that nothing is now left. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Some translations have the gentle whisper. Other translations have the sound of silence. So whether it is a still small voice, whether it is a whisper, whether it is the sound of silence, now, only now does Elijah hear it. And so the question is, how can you hear the sound of silence? Will you not have to strain to hear the whisper? Will you not have to strain to hear the still small voice? And the answer is no. Because the sound of silence, the whisper, and the still small voice is of God. So God is not in the wind which smashes rocks and brings down mountains. God is not in the earthquake which swallows everything in sight. And God is not in the fire which scorches and burns everything. But God is in the still small voice. What does this mean? It means that God will come when we least expect Him. We have been through this COVID-19 pandemic. We have been struggling with finding answers as to how we can respond, as to how we must cope. And there have been times when we have been on the verge of giving up, when we have despaired, when we have lost hope, when we have refused to believe and said, there is no God. Because if there was a God, by now we would have had an answer to our situation. That is like the wind. That is like the earthquake. That is like the fire. And the Lord is not in any of these. And the Lord is in the still small voice, which we don't have to strain, but which we have to open our hearts to believe, much like what happens in the gospel text of today. The disciples are in a boat, and some of them were expert fishermen. And even as they are in this boat, and even as they have expert fishermen, they are struggling to make headway with their rowing. They are hardly moving forward. The COVID-19 has overtaken them. They are on the verge of despairing. They want to give up. They want to give in. There seems to be no reason to continue. There seems to be no reason to hope. How long, Lord? How long? And then in the darkest hour of the morn, between 3 and 6 a.m., when we are at our weakest, when we are at our most fragile, when we are frail, the Lord comes to us. And the Lord does two things to identify himself when he comes to us. And the first is that he walks on water. In the Old Testament, walking on water was an attribute only which God had. No human being could walk on water. And so when Matthew tells us that Jesus came to his disciples walking on water, he is already saying that Jesus is revealing himself as God. And the second revelation that Jesus makes when the disciples are frightened, when the disciples are terrified, they imagine all sorts of things about the Lord. They cannot recognize him, and because they cannot recognize him, they make all sorts of labels about who he is. He is a ghost, and they were terrified. And the Lord speaks, and the Lord reveals himself with the divine name Ego Eimi, I am. And this divine name, in the present situation, is a name which must give us confidence. It is a name which says not, I was. It is a name which says not, I will be. It is a name which says, I am. It is asking us not to be worried about the wind which will shatter rocks. It is asking us not to worry about the earthquake which will swallow everything inside. It is asking us not to be worried about the fire which will scorch. It is asking us to be attentive to that still small voice, because if we are, then we can see the Lord walking on the water, not defying the law of gravity, but the Lord subduing the forces of evil which cannot pull him down. And if we are disciples of the Lord, and if we are in the boat, and if we are rowing, the forces of evil cannot pull us down, because our Lord reveals himself to us as I am. Will you attempt to hear that still small voice, to hear that whisper, to hear that sound of silence, and even in it to hear the Lord say to you, I am, do not be afraid.